On January 25th, 1959, a somewhat elderly, rotund, and thoroughly unintimidating Pope, John the 23rd, announced to a few of his advisors at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls the fundamental agenda for his papacy, which had 3 planks. First, to revise the Code of Canon Law, which had first been promulgated in 1914 and was badly in need of revision. Second, to convene a diocesan synod for the local Church of Rome, thereby reminding everyone there that the Pope is Pope only because he is bishop of a local church. And third, almost in passing, that he intended to convene the first ecumenical council in 90 years. That council, which met from 1962 to 1965, in which he presided over but the one first session, his successor, Paul VI, presided over the final 3, was, in retrospect, the most important event in the history of Catholicism, at least going back to the Protestant Reformation. And yet, as one of my favorite theologians from your country, one of my favorite theologians from the world, and a colleague of Sister Maeve, Orm Rush, has reminded us, every ecumenical council must be interpreted not just in terms of its texts, but also in terms of its ongoing reception. That ecumenical councils are living realities in the church, and it's the task of the church to receive that counsel. And Professor Rush reminds us that reception is never a passive assent to the teaching of the church, but an active appropriation, such that when the church appropriates the teaching of a council, when the church makes it its own, it in some way adds to, enriches, fructifies the teaching of the council. And so that process of active reception is still at work in the church today. The late Dominican theologian Yves Congar once said it takes the church generally about 100 years to fully receive a council, which means that we are just over the halfway mark of that reception. And I want to argue that the first pope in the modern era, not to have been at the Second Vatican Council, Pope Francis, who had not yet been ordained a priest when the council closed, is in fact the Pope who is most profoundly leading the church in an active reception of the council's teaching. And I remind you that an active reception means more than implementation. It means a creative appropriation where one takes the unfinished work of that council and, listening to the Spirit, imagines where the Spirit might be taking us as we move forward. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is to guide you through how I think Pope Francis is helping us actively receive the council's teaching. I'll begin with broader, more impressionistic themes that we see in the Pope's ministry that suggest how he's carrying forward in a faithful and yet creative way the council's vision. And then I'm going to focus in on one particular aspect of his ministry that I think is of particular significance. So I begin with the claim that the first, that's not too bad. Do it the old-fashioned way. The first insight from Pope Francis is his understanding of the church as a call to the peripheries. The church as field hospital. Started with an interview question. Pope Francis, what kind of church do you dream of? And the Pope answered, I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. We're going to come back to that in a moment. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It is useless to ask a seriously injured person if he has high cholesterol and about the level of his blood sugars. You have to heal the wounds. This is, I would suggest to you, an extraordinary image of the church. And it reflects, I believe, the way in which Francis is re-receiving one of the council's most important intuitions. When in Ad Gentis, Article 2, thank you. In Ad Gentis, Article 2, the council taught that the church was missionary by its very nature. And I think Pope Francis has taken that formal teaching about the council's assertion that the church is missionary, and he's given it an incredibly earthy image. In fact, I don't know whether you're familiar with this here. This is a part of the fruitfulness of this metaphor, I think, is generational in character. Did you have the possibility here, I don't know, was MASH a TV show that was shown here? Yeah. See, my students, of course, oh good, well my students, of course, are unaware of this. We've got all sorts of interesting things going on. Thank you both for trying to fix my, all right. So, all right, we're not going. Let's not sit that up. I'll be fine. Thank you very much. Don't worry about that. You're very kind. So, I know. Am I still back to Field Hospital? Okay, all right. I'm completely thrown off my game. So, no, that's no one's fault but mine. Yeah, I mean, my students know nothing about MASH. But I found the moment I heard this, when the Pope did this, I don't have any idea whether he knows anything about the TV show MASH, but it immediately evoked so much, right? Because the MASH show, with all of its humor, absolutely filled out exactly what he was talking about. These are doctors who are in marginal situations with inadequate resources, who don't have the luxury to follow all the rules, who ignore all the niceties of military rank and protocol, who have to make do with what they have, and who, at all costs, put the patient first and don't ask questions about what side they're on, right? And so when I think about what that MASH did, it teased out all of the richness of this particular metaphor. And I have to say, this Pope is unprecedented in his ecclesiological instincts for creative new metaphors. Indeed, he has a particular love for geometric imagery, and we'll see that in just a few moments. But in his introduction of the field hospital metaphor, he emphasizes that geometric image in which he calls the church to move from the center out to the peripheries, right? And indeed, there's a twofold movement here. We could say that in Pope Francis's ecclesiology, there is both a centrifugal and a centripetal movement. The centrifugal movement is the church's determination to move outside of itself and to address people where they are. But the centripetal movement is the recognition that the people in the trenches, on the margins, on the peripheries, have something to offer us. And so then there's a movement from the outside back in as the church benefits from the riches of the local church. As my colleague Christopher Ruddy put it, the Pope revises and even reverses the spatial imagery of center and periphery. The church's center is found paradoxically in its peripheries. The church comes to itself by going out of itself. A powerful, concrete, earthy evocation of what the council taught when it said that the church was missionary by its nature. Closely related to this is the Pope's conviction that when we go to the periphery, what we're after is radical proximity, closeness, meeting people where they are. And when the Pope has talked about this radical proximity, he is in many ways invoking an important theological influence on him that goes back to his time as Archbishop in Argentina, in which he was very much influenced by a particular school of liberation theology known as La Teología del Pueblo, which was, by the way, quite particular to Argentina. And it had its own particular nuances. It was not quite as focused on socioeconomic analysis. It was much more focused on lo cotidiano, on the ordinary, on the experience of the people their customs, their practices, the way they had practically received the gospel and given it flesh within their culture. And the Pope was convinced that we have something to learn from the ordinary people of God's personal appropriation of the faith in their particular cultural context. And so when he invoked, as he frequently did, one of the most underappreciated teachings of Vatican II, the sensus fidei, the supernatural instinct for the faith that all of us have, the Pope emphasized that not only must we pay attention to the sense of the faithful, we must pay particular attention to the poor and to the way in which their appropriation of the gospel is refracted through their particular cultures. And so there's this emphasis right from the start on the richness of the church lying in the diverse cultural appropriations of the gospel and our need to attend to those. I'll come back to that a little bit later. A third feature of his vision of the church is the call to accompaniment. The call to accompaniment. And we've already heard the wonderful image invoked in this session, in this conference, where the Pope speaks of the importance of having the smell of the sheep on us. Now, what's interesting about that is I've traced the various ways and places in which he's employed that image, and he's rather promiscuous in his use of that image. So in a conference for professed religious life, he spoke of the importance of consecrated religious going to the peripheries and having the smell of the sheep on them. At an Episcopal ordination, he said the importance of bishops going out and having the smell of the sheep on them. Priests need to have the smell of the sheep on them. And ordinary people of God who exercise in the missionary work of the church must also do that. This is this curious sense in which it's not just a few leaders that leave their offices and go to the periphery. This transposition of center and periphery is something that affects all of us. All of us are called to move from a place of security and comfort and move out to reach out to people where they are and to walk with them. We need, the Pope insists, a church that knows how to open her arms and welcome everyone. Fourth, one of the leitmotifs of this papacy is its emphasis on mercy. He writes, we need a church, I already said that, we need a church that knows how to open her arms and welcome everyone. And then he applies this notion of mercy to the Eucharist. We alluded to this yesterday. The Eucharist, he says, although it is the fullness of sacramental life, is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. These convictions, he says, have pastoral consequences. And if I can pause for just a moment, it seems to me this is one of the distinctive contributions of Pope Francis. In many instances, he is calling forth an often neglected teaching of the Council, invoking that teaching, but here's what's, I think, distinctive about it. He then says, okay, if we believe that, that has practical consequences, right? He's not the first Pope to talk about the church as a church of mercy, right? I mean, every Pope has done that. In fact, Pope John Paul II wrote a wonderful encyclical focusing on the God of mercy. What is distinctive is the way he says, well, if we're that, then these things have to happen, right? And that has been a rather provocative move. If we are a church of mercy, how does that affect our pastoral life? In the parish, for example. And he applies to the Eucharist, a central feature of parochial life. These convictions have pastoral consequences that we're called to consider with prudence and boldness. Frequently, he says, we act as arbiters of grace rather than its facilitators, but the church is not a toll house. It's the house of the Father where there's a place for everyone with all their problems. So we have a church constituted by radical hospitality, inclusivity, and mercy. Fifth, the Pope calls us to be a vulnerable, messy church. The church, he says, has sometimes locked itself up in small things, in small-minded rules. And yet those who would work in the church's field hospital have to recognize that's the ordinary way of things, you see. The genius of his imagining the church as a field hospital is he wants to say, if you think of the church as a field hospital, you should expect that you're going to have to work out in a messy way how to improvise when the law of the church doesn't foresee your particular situation. Now, by the way, this is a basic intuition in Catholic theology about the limits of law. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century famously said, every law applies ut in pluribus, in the majority of instances. But it generally only applies in the majority of instances because lawmakers can never anticipate every possible application of the law. Right? Which is why canon law and moral theology tells us in the application of the law we must appropriate the virtue of epikeia. The virtue of epikeia is not about a legalistic application of the law. It's about going to the spirit of the law, trying to understand the pastoral intentionality of the law, and finding an application that is honoring that situation. Here we see Pope Francis's pastoral instincts coming to the fore. And so when he talks about the value of a vulnerable, messy church, he again employs some marvelously earthy images to describe it. He says, I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and from clinging to its own security. I do not want a church concerned with being at the center, and which then ends up by being caught up in a web of obsessions and procedures. It's hard for us in Australia, in the United States, to not want to email this text to certain leaders and say, what would it look like if we could witness in our culture a church willing to be vulnerable, messy, hurting, willing to make mistakes out of a priority, a preferential option for mercy and compassion rather than good order and propriety and the preservation of institutional reputation. There's much to be culled here from our Pope's remarkable vision. Pope Francis has far more patience with a church that makes mistakes in the field than a church that's closed in upon itself. And so I've highlighted these basic sort of thematic features of the Pope's active appropriation of the council. But what I want to do now is to show how it bears fruit in a very important area, because I am convinced that Pope Francis is for the first time fulfilling the hope of Pope John the 23rd. So let me take you back to now not January 25th, 1959, but October 11th, 1962, the opening of the Second Vatican Council. If you attended that liturgy and stayed till the end, you would have heard the Pope's remarkable opening address. A lot of people didn't hear it because that liturgy lasted 6 hours. But in that address, the Pope gave one of the most remarkable speeches of any Pope in modern history, in which he said this: council is not to be a council of condemnation. In the past, the church found it necessary to make use of the medicine of condemnation. Now it seems more opportune to make use of the medicine of mercy. And then he says, I hope for a church that will have a magisterium that is truly pastoral in character. And I believe that with Pope Francis, we are seeing him model a new understanding of pastoral teaching authority. With Pope Francis, we are beginning to see what a pastoral magisterium would look like. And much as with the council, where when the council said, when John called for a council to be pastoral, he did not mean as opposed to doctrinal. This is the most important thing that I want us to get from all of this. The French theologian Christophe Theobald speaks of Vatican II as calling us to, I love this expression, the pastorality of doctrine. The pastorality of doctrine. In other words, to avoid the bifurcation that's become so common for many of us, to imagine doctrine here and pastoral accommodation here, but rather to imagine doctrine and pastoral ministry as intimately connected with one another. So that there's not a light switch that goes on, right? A toggle. Doctrinal teaching, pastoral application. Doctrinal teaching, pastoral application. But the recognition that there is not a doctrine in the church that did not at its beginnings emerge out of a pastoral context. The doctrine of the Trinity emerged out of the most basic questions. To whom shall we pray? And almost every teaching of the church emerged out of a pastoral consideration, must be interpreted in the light of that initial pastoral consideration, and must be applied in new pastoral contexts. This reimagined pastoral teaching authority, or pastoral magisterium, has a number of features, and I'd like to focus on those for the balance of my time here. Well, for the balance of this session. The call to a more pastoral teaching authority, and here, I hope you'll forgive me, but I want us to stay close to Pope Francis' own text, mostly because I don't want anybody to accuse me of imposing on Francis my own vision of church teaching. The call to a pastoral teaching authority has a number of features. First, a pastoral magisterium serves a synodal church, and I mentioned this yesterday. The Pope's retrieval of synodality. While the Synod on Marriage and Family was going on, he gave a speech honoring a somewhat inconsequential event in many ways. He was honoring the 50th anniversary of the creation of the Synod of Bishops. Now, it was appropriate to do so because the Synod was in fact going on. But the Synod of Bishops, which had been created by Pope Paul VI, was quite frankly something of a disappointment. The bishops at the council had been calling for the creation of a permanent synod of bishops that would on a daily basis assist the Bishop of Rome in his pastoral ministry to the universal church. Indeed, one of my favorite figures at the Second Vatican Council, the Melkite Patriarch Maximus IV, Saig, an 84-year-old prelate, who, by the way, refused at every instance to speak in Latin, the law of the church, of the council, because, of course, Latin was not the language of his tradition. First time he gave an address, he began to speak in French. The president of the assembly quietly interrupted him and reminded him of the rules of the council, and he nodded. He, of course, knew Latin perfectly well, but he continued on in French and received an ovation at the end. How are you going to penalize an 84-year-old patriarch? What did he care? But Maximus was one of many who said, you know, if you look at our Eastern churches and the riches of our Eastern churches, we have a tradition of permanent standing synods, bishops who assist a metropolitan or a patriarch in the exercise of their ministry. And many of the bishops in the council thought that would be very important, a counterweight to the kind of overemphasized influence of the Roman Curia. And yet Pope Paul VI, in a rather unfortunate, uncollegial gesture, created a synod of bishops on his own, but it wasn't a standing synod. It would meet only every 3 years. It would have only consultative authority, and the Vatican would have considerable say in what its agenda was and who attended it. Now, Pope Francis has done a great deal to rehabilitate some of the prospective power of the synod as an institution. But when he gave that address in October of 2015, I believe it was, he didn't focus on the Synod of Bishops. He focused on synodality. He invoked the etymological root of the word synodos, which means literally going on a journey together, traveling together, and suggested that there doesn't much matter if we're going to have synods unless we understand the church is synodal. This is an important point. We've had a number of dioceses and archdioceses in the United States in which their bishops have called synods, and I thought they were a colossal waste of time because they were controlled from beginning to end by the local curia, right, chancery. Everything was orchestrated from beginning to end. Certain topics, some of the most important topics people were interested in, were simply kept off the table. Those who were allowed to participate were carefully vetted to make sure they fit a particular profile. Right? Having a synod doesn't mean much at all unless you're committed to synodality. Right? Which for Pope Francis, and here again, he employs a geometric image, means a radical reimagination of the church. In this church, as in an inverted pyramid, the top is located beneath the base. Consequently, those who exercise authority are called, I love this, ministers. Because in the original meaning of the word, they are the least of all. It is in serving the people of God that each bishop becomes, for that portion of the flock entrusted to him, vicarius Christi, a vicar of Christ. The vicar of that Jesus who at the Last Supper bent down to wash the feet of the apostles. And in a similar perspective, the successor of Peter is nothing else if not the servus servorum Dei, servant of the servants of God. So the first thing he suggests is if we're going to be a synodal church, we have to recognize that those in leadership are to place themselves in a position of humble service and listening. There's potential for this, by the way, in the Code of Canon Law, but it's frankly almost entirely ignored. One of the canons of the Code of Canon Law provides that a bishop or his proxy must visit every parish in his diocese at least once every 5 years. And I often imagine what would happen if, as ordinary practice, in the fulfillment of that particular canon, a bishop would place it upon himself the responsibility when visiting each of his parishes to have an open town hall meeting with a microphone at the podium and his sitting quietly in the back. And simply allowing everyone who wanted to come and speak and to express the fruit of their own sensus fidei. That would be a synodal church. Goes on later in that same speech. A synodal church is a church which listens, which realizes that listening is more than simply hearing. It is a mutual listening in which everyone has something to learn. The faithful people, the College of Bishops, the Bishop of Rome, all listening to each other and all listening to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of truth, in order to know what he says to the churches. I want to go back to a provocative question that was posed to me yesterday, and you might have thought I dodged it. But I wasn't trying to dodge it. I was giving the most honest answer I can give. I'm frequently asked questions about certain provocative teachings in the church, where there might be a critical mass in the audience who would like to see that teaching change, and they want to invoke the authority of the speaker in favor of their particular view. Be honest. That's how it usually works. And I tend to resist that, not because I might not be in sympathy, but because I think we're getting the whole thing backwards. You see, the whole point of discernment is not you and I advocating for our particular agendas. The point of discernment is that we listen to the Spirit. And we trust that the Spirit, when allowed to work in our church, will guide us in the appropriate way. What I think about the appropriateness of the ordination of women or our treatment of LGBT persons, including my son, is actually not very important. Ecclesiologically, what's more important is that we become a synodal church, leaders and all the baptized, who have the courage to at least temporarily put aside our particular agendas and convictions and have the courage to humbly listen, including listening to those with whom we disagree. If we become that church, I'm confident with where the Spirit will lead us. But that's what I want to fight for. Do I have personal views about teachings X, Y, and Z? Absolutely. Get me away from the microphone and a name tag. I'll be happy to talk to you about it. But as an ecclesiologist, I'm more committed to this. Because if we become this, because I believe in the church, and because I believe in the Holy Spirit, I'm confident those other things will find their place. Does that make sense? This is where we need to invest our energy right now. Later in Evangelii Gaudium, the Pope says he wants bishops who will encourage and develop means of participation out of a desire to listen to everyone and not simply to those who would tell him what he would like to hear. I mentioned this yesterday, and it's worth reiterating because it's true not just of the bishops, it's true of all of us. You see, I am convinced that in the United States, perhaps Australia is a marvelous exception, but in the United States, I fear our church has been uncritically colonized by the politics of demonization that we hear on television and talk radio. And the particular grammar of the politics of demonization goes like this: always, and at every opportunity, impute the worst of intentions on your opponents. Never grant the kernel of truth, the insight, the wisdom of the opposing party. Never yield the value of any aspect of their position. Demonize them. Because if I demonize you and your opposition, I don't need to attend to you. You're a benighted idiot. You're a troglodyte. You're uninformed. You're a traditionalist. Or you're a feminazi. Works in both directions. Once I've demonized you, I don't need to listen to you. Right? A synodal church cannot fall prey to the politics of demonization. It cannot succumb to the kind of echo chamber where, at least in the United States, our intellectual elites, that is, our educated Catholics who are really active and well-read in the faith, can be divided by those who read the National Catholic Reporter and never look at First Things, and those who read First Things and never look at the National Catholic Reporter. That may not mean anything to you, but one's a far left and one's a far right journal, and the internet, which one hoped would have democratized this, has simply reinforced it because it's even easier than it's ever been to go to websites which convince me of the obvious rightness and superiority of my own position over against others. And we need to understand the smugness and the arrogance of that and recognize that it is an impediment to becoming what Pope Francis is calling a truly synodal church. The call to synodality is not just something we throw in the faces of our bishops. It is a challenge for everyone in this room. And if we're honest, it comes easily to none of us. Synodality is not just for the Pope and bishops. It's for you and me. A second feature of Pope Francis' distinctive teaching ministry is his recognition that a pastoral magisterium teaches more by symbolic gesture than by juridical decree. Now, there's an interesting situation here because I think Pope Francis, see, I just have this longing to go over there and talk over here. I feel like you're getting neglected in some way here. So, Pope John Paul II, I think, was the first to do this. I think part of the genius of Pope John Paul II was his recognition of the power of the symbolic gesture. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I think of the papacy of John Paul II, there are images that come to my mind. One of the images is of the Pope getting off the plane and kissing the ground the first time he visited the country. Another is a picture that appeared on the cover of Time magazine in our country of the Pope in the cell of his would-be assassin, sitting at a stool and praying for his would-be assassin. Another somewhat more troubling image was the Pope on his visit to Nicaragua, wagging his finger at Father Cardinal, who was on one knee. The Pope understood, Pope John Paul II, that images, symbols, often teach louder and more effectively than decrees. He understood that on the global arena. My one regret is that he was less confident about that within the life of the church, where there he was more willing, it seems to me, to engage in a kind of a strong emphasis on juridical authority and penal authority. All right? And I don't want to suggest that that's never necessary in the church, but I think it ought to always be our absolute last resort in the life of the church. Pope Francis has, I think, taken the baton from John Paul II, and note that I have suggested it skips over Pope Benedict, who was and is a wonderful, marvelous, holy man and theologian, but I think was singularly unequipped for the office of the papacy, and was, quite frankly, tone deaf to the importance of the symbolic gesture. So, for example, one of his failed but well-meaning attempts at a symbolic gesture was his offering to rescind the excommunication of 4 Lefebvrite bishops, only to discover that one of them was a Holocaust desire and a racist. Right? Ironically, by the way, perhaps the greatest symbolic, most important, most positive symbolic gesture of Pope Benedict, and I don't mean this in a snide way, I mean this as an ecclesiologist, was his resignation. Not because I was glad that he resigned, but by resigning he reminded the church of something incredibly important. At the end of the day, the papacy is a church office, like that of a pastor or a bishop. And just as with a pastor or a bishop, when your human abilities are inadequate to the task, you need to step down. Right? And he understood that, and that was a great gift that Pope Benedict gave to the church in that symbolic act. But Pope Francis has taken on this sense, this conviction that we can teach far more effectively through the symbolic gestures. Right? And we've seen it in a number of images. One of the most powerful I alluded to yesterday was within a week of his papacy, his breaking liturgical law, which he would subsequently change, by washing the feet of women, Muslims at a juvenile detention center. Many of us are familiar with this poignant embrace of men covered with sores. But actually my favorite symbolic gesture, because it's not a symbolic gesture, it is who Pope Francis is, and it's calling us to be a little more like that, is Pope Francis is eating in the cafeteria, side by side with janitors. Right? Who, by the way, don't seem to be paying much attention to it. I think it's worth pointing out. Maybe they don't know who he is. I don't know. I'm thinking they do. But a wonderful symbolic gesture of humanity, of the minister being the least, as Pope Francis reminded us. And so he has suggested to us we teach more effectively through these symbolic expressions of what the gospel is about. Third, a pastoral magisterium is committed to ecclesial decentralization. In Evangelii Gaudium, he insisted that it's not necessary to imagine that the Pope should pronounce on every question. Magisterium doesn't need to respond to every question. In fact, he suggested there are a lot of instances where the local bishops ought to be dealing with things. One of the most audacious features of this Pope's ecclesiastical documents, unprecedented in the history of the papacy, is the extent to which he does not cite his own documents, nor the documents of his predecessors, but the documents of episcopal conferences. This is quite striking. 10 times in Amoris Laetitia and 20 times in Laudato Si, the Pope cites the teaching of regional bishops' conferences, which he wants to suggest that many of the important questions facing us should be faced in a particular region, that region of the church, which understands what's going on much better. In ecclesiology, we call this the ecclesial application of the principle of subsidiarity, that all things being equal, problems are best dealt with at the local level, but when the local level is incapable of addressing it adequately, higher authority is authorized to intervene. But there's another aspect to this commitment to decentralization, and it goes back to what I suggested earlier about the Pope's commitment to radical proximity. One of the reasons why he wants to avoid a heavy-handed universal teaching authority is not that he doesn't think it's necessary, but he thinks that there's a danger of our losing the giftedness of more particular insights Right? That's that radical proximity, going back to the faith and customs of the people. He wants to hold a place within a church that clearly must be united in its profession of the apostolic faith. There's no disputing that. He is, let me remind you, without any doubt, a doctrinal conservative. Right? There's no fudging that. There's no apology for that from him. But he thinks that within a church that must be united around its faith, its profession of the apostolic faith, there must be more room for difference, for other voices to find their place in the church, even voices that might be partially in error. And so once again, the Pope moves to a geometric metaphor to capture the richness of the church. In a text, by the way, that's extraordinarily dense, so forgive me, but we'll go through it slowly. Here, our motto, he says, is not the sphere, which is no greater than its parts, where every point is equidistant from the center and there are no differences between them. Instead, his image of the church is the polyhedron, which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness. Pastoral and political activity alike seek to gather in this polyhedron the best of each. There's a place for the poor and their culture, their aspirations and their potential. Even people who, this is just friggin' remarkable, I'm sorry. You cannot let this go by. Right, maybe that word doesn't work here. I've been around my kids too long. There is a place, but even people who can be considered dubious on account of their errors have something to offer which must not be overlooked. You cannot let that pass by without our drinking in the implications of that. Now, I want to remind you, he is not saying normative teaching is irrelevant. I was trying to emphasize this yesterday, and I'll come back to it. What he is offering us is what I would call a more elastic notion of normativity. He does not want to let go of the teaching of the church, but neither is he threatened by people who are, recall the image, troubled by the church's teaching. He wants us to be troubled, and he thinks you're being troubled as a result of your wrestling with it, and you're communicating the concerns, the difficulties. That contributes to the polyhedron. That has a constructive role to play in the life of the church. This is remarkable stuff. It is the convergence of peoples who, within the universal order, maintain their own individuality. It is the sum total of persons within a society which pursues the common good, which truly has a place for everyone. This is a bold reimagination of our church and its teaching. 4. The pastoral magisterium exhibits an appropriate doctrinal humility. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that he is at this point rehabilitating another teaching of the council that had largely been neglected. First, at the Second Vatican Council, this is going to go off, but this is as far as I go. Believe me, you don't want to see. You wouldn't in the best of circumstances. You really wouldn't. So, doctrinal humility. Dei Verbum, Article 8, one of the richest passages of the Second Vatican Council, the dogmatic constitution of divine revelation. When it speaks about the development of tradition and talks of how the Holy Spirit allows tradition to grow in multiple ways. First and foremost, by the intimate experience of believers, by their contemplation and study, and by the sure preaching and teaching of the bishops. Through the work of the Spirit, the church moves toward the fullness of divine truth. I was taught that the church has the truth in its back pocket. The council said we're moving toward divine truth. Why? Because, as Lumen Gentium chapter 7 reminds us, it is not just that we are a church of pilgrims. We are a pilgrim church. which means the church qua church is on a journey. Not wandering aimlessly. It has a direction. It has a guide. It knows where it's going. It has some sense of what its journey is about, but it has not yet arrived. And because it has not yet arrived, there's more to learn. And so elsewhere, in the Decree on Ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio, Article 11, the Council speaks of the hierarchy of truths, where it says, look, among the many dogmatic teachings of the Church, some are more central to the articulation of the foundations of the Christian faith than others. Now I must tell you, this remarkable teaching was mentioned one time in papal documents, from its promulgation in 1965 until the time of Pope Francis. One time. A remarkable yet largely neglected insight that the church must have a certain doctrinal humility in which we may affirm both the truth of our teachings and the way in which they cannot be the final word. Because revelation ultimately comes to us not in propositional statements, but in a person, Jesus Christ, who we never master, never grasp as one would grasp the periodic table in chemistry. Pope Francis has recovered that conciliar commitment to doctrinal humility, right? And suggests that when we approach church doctrine, we have a little more humility about it. And here I'm going to give you a series of passages to kind of emphasize as strongly as I can why this is one of the most important insights of Pope Francis, how he's reimagining doctrine, what Theobald calls the pastorality of doctrine. And so first, we see this pastoral ministry is not obsessed with the disjointed transmission of a multitude of doctrines to be insistently imposed. When we adopt a pastoral goal in a missionary style, which would actually reach everyone without exception or exclusion, the message has to concentrate on the essentials. Sister Maeve will love this. On what is most beautiful, most grand, most appealing, and at the same time most necessary. The message is simplified while losing none of its depth and truth, and thus becomes all the more forceful and convincing. Right when I was going to stop, I just want to point out that I started a little late. Some issues. Just want to remind you. A little more time. In an address, he says, doctrine is not a closed, private system deprived of dynamics, able to raise questions and doubts. On the contrary, Christian doctrine has a face, a body, flesh. It's called Jesus Christ. And it is his life that is offered from generation to generation to all men and women in all places. You appreciate that I put much of this together as part of a rather spirited response to the 5% Dr. McKay's work with which I took issue, which is belief that it's best that we move beyond doctrine. And I am invoking Pope Francis to suggest there's another way, which is an imaginative reappropriation of the proper role of doctrine and a distancing ourselves from the tendency to rely on doctrine on steroids. The true defenders of doctrine, he says, are not those who uphold its letter, but its spirit, not ideas, but people, not formulae, but the gratuitousness of God's love and forgiveness. The church's first duty is not to hand down condemnations or anathemas, but to proclaim God's mercy, to call to conversion, and to lead all men and women to salvation in the Lord. All right, now this is small text, dense passage, extraordinarily rich. So one of the things that Pope Francis is going to do in this text is he's drawing from a term he got from a famous French theologian, now not Yves Congar, but Henri de Lubac. Henri de Lubac famously condemned what de Lubac called spiritual worldliness. Now, I'll be honest with you, I'm not wild about the term because I think it has resonances for us today that are quite different from what de Lubac and Pope Francis intended. All right, but such as it is. The Pope uses this. And he gives us this extraordinarily dense passage, all right? But it's worth our time, really it is, even if you don't get tea. You know? But what I love about this is the even-handedness. Because what Pope Francis is going to say here is that spiritual worldliness appears in two different forms. So none of us gets away unscathed here. All right? Let's be clear. None of us goes unscathed. So the first form, he says, this worldliness can be fueled in two deeply interrelated ways. One is the attraction of what he calls Gnosticism, a purely subjective faith whose only interest is a certain experience or a set of ideas and bits of information which are meant to console and enlighten, but which ultimately keep one imprisoned in his or her own thoughts and feelings. We need to stop there. I have no wish to condemn the many people who Mr. McKay described as spiritual but not religious. But I want to argue that the Pope is suggesting there are some serious dangers, inadequacies in simply celebrating a suffuse spirituality, right? And the danger is it will be mighty tempting for you to go out and collect little bits of wisdom that allow you to feel good about yourself. And within limits, there's nothing wrong with feeling good about yourself. But at some point, spirituality needs to be more than just reinforcing our own preferences for how the world ought to be. At some point, a robust spirituality has to also kind of call us to another place. Does that follow? So when he's speaking of the dangers of a subjective Gnosticism, well, I don't want to be harsh. I think he's naming something important. Be wary of the tendency today for spirituality to become commodified. Right? Carefully constructed experiences. And I would warn you, I said this a little bit in our workshop, I worry about this, even in things like youth ministry. In the United States, we have a number of very popular youth-oriented retreats called Kairos, Search, and so on, which are carefully constructed retreat experiences crafted to create an emotional experience. Usually through sleep deprivation. Many of us know what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying those are the worst things in the world, but there's a danger of us unintentionally pandering to a very commodified notion of spirituality as something to be consumed, ready at hand. The absolute opposite of what Sister May suggested when she spoke of waiting. Right? In a consumer culture, waiting is the enemy. Right? So Pope Francis is right to warn of a spiritual worldliness that wants to turn the spiritual life into a commodity, that reinforces all of our interests and challenges us not one whit to conversion. Then he goes on, and I have to confess, it's interesting that he says more about the second than the first. The other is, I love this. This is just the self-absorbed Promethean neo-Pelagianism. I'll be honest, I'm just going to let that go because to break that down would require a half hour in Greek mythology and all sorts of things that we don't have time for. But you got to love that, right? Never before had those words appeared, by the way, together. I just want you to know. Never. And probably never again. The other is the self-absorbed Promethean neo-Pelagianism of those who ultimately trust only in their own powers and feel superior to others because they observe certain rules or remain intransigently faithful to a particular Catholic style from the past. I want to point out that I didn't hear that ooh. Right, you just need to ponder a little your selective ooh and see what it says to you. That's for you and your spiritual director to work out. We need to be even-handed in our oohing. A supposed soundness of doctrine, no oohs, or discipline leads instead to a narcissistic and authoritarian elitism, whereby instead of evangelizing, one analyzes and classifies others, and instead of opening the door to grace, one exhausts his or her energies in inspecting and verifying. In neither case, Gnosticism, Promethean neo-Pelagianism, In neither case, I lost my line, is one really concerned about Jesus Christ or others. These are manifestations of an anthropocentric immanentism. The good news is you really can pass over those and it doesn't matter. It is impossible to think that a genuine evangelizing thrust could emerge from these adulterated forms of Christianity. Right? That's dense, but that is rich fare. That is a rich and perceptive analysis of our situation that leaves nobody untouched, if we're honest. Then I love this. If one has answers to all the questions, that's the proof that God is not with him. It means that he's a false prophet using religion for himself. The great leaders of the people of God, like Moses, have always left room for doubt. Fifth, a pastoral magisterium serves the practice of discernment and the formation of consciences. If you pushed me, and I teach a lot in the Second Vatican Council, I've written a little bit about it, but if you pushed me and said, Rick, one sentence, what was Vatican II about? My answer would be this. Vatican II called us to become an adult church. Not a child church, an adult church. It called us to a mature appropriation of our faith and the exercise of conscience, which is not, I hasten to remind you, doing what I want, but a careful, prayerful listening to the still voice of God within us, calling us to do this, to shun that. The Pope says, and this reflects, it seems to me, his entire papacy, that's what we're about. That's what mature discipleship is about. Raising people with formed consciences and then encouraging them to exercise them and respecting what happens. So he writes, I love this. We clergy and other pastoral ministers find it hard to make room for the consciences of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel and their limitations, and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. A remarkable text in a host of remarkable texts. In my workshop, I talked about the obligation that you and I have as public ministers of the church to walk with people, to accompany them as they wrestle with the teaching of the church. And I suggested that we're called to avoid a liberal and a conservative paternalism when it comes to forming consciences. The conservative paternalism simply says, this is the teaching of the church, obey it, or you're not Catholic. A liberal paternalism says, pay attention to these teachings, but you can ignore these. These are silly and nobody takes them seriously. Many of us are tempted to one or other of those paternalisms. For it's common that you and I, people who do pastoral ministry, have our own struggles, our own concerns. There are particular teachings with which we take issue. And if we are honest, we are mightily tempted to save other people from the struggle we've had. We've already figured out that you can ignore Humanae Vitae. So there's no point teaching it. They don't need to hear it. Are these subtle hints that I'm supposed to finish? Yeah. All right. I'm almost done. Forming consciences means that you have to help people learn the teaching of the church, even the teachings that you yourself may find troublesome. Why? Because you have no right to rob them of the right to wrestle with the faith themselves, to be troubled by it themselves. Does that follow? Otherwise, we're doing the very thing that Pope Francis is telling us not to do. We're treating the people we minister as children who can't handle the wrestling that we've done because we're the spiritual elite. Right? An important teaching with important implications for all of us. Finally, a pastoral magisterium is reluctant to pronounce prematurely on controverted issues. The Pope is very clear about the Church's official teaching, but he seems remarkably nonplussed by people who struggle with it. Right? And this is what I meant by an elastic notion of doctrinal normativity. He will not yield on his belief in the rightness of the church's teaching, but he's not arrogant enough to believe that people who disagree have nothing to offer, have no insight, may not be raising important questions. So he does not think that it's important for the papacy to pronounce on every question. And I'm going to come back to this, and this is what I'm going to end on. And I realize I've gone a little bit over time, but we'll still have time for questions. There are many people who, as much as they love Pope Francis's style, chafe at the fact that at the end of the day he's a doctrinal conservative. Chafe at the fact that they have now come to terms with the fact that he is not likely to change the church's teaching on any number of things that they would like to see that teaching change. And my answer to you is you misunderstand how doctrine develops. Doctrine rarely changes by papal fiat. The church for a long time taught usury, lending money and charging interest was a mortal sin, never to be justified. Gradually, we revised that teaching, not because a pope all of a sudden issued an encyclical, but because those who were trying to implement the teaching on the ground increasingly found it impossible to implement that teaching with some degree of pastoral integrity. It was not one massive papal decree that allowed us to distance ourselves from Thomas Aquinas' teaching that women are inferior to men on the order of nature. It was the gradual working of the sense of the people of God and people in pastoral ministry who, as we learned from forces outside the church about the dignity of women, an insight embedded in our tradition but too easily ignored, the church gradually comes to recognize the incompatibility of claiming that women are inferior to men in the order of nature with what the gospel teaches. And then at some point it simply was taken for granted in papal teaching that that's what we always taught. My point is that the papacy's role is not to pronounce at the beginning of a conflict but at the end. We should welcome a pope unwilling to prematurely close debate and conversation. A pope who's willing to say, this is what the teaching is here and now, but you're not going to get me upset if you struggle with it. Just don't expect me to change it at a moment's notice. That's not how the Spirit works. That's not how doctrine develops in the life of the church. So to tell you the truth, I'm okay with the doctrinally conservative pope because his understanding of doctrine is sufficiently elastic to allow for the interruptive work of the Holy Spirit. And I encourage you to consider that possibility as well. Thank you.